Lesson 57, Review. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 171 in Lesson 57. This is in fact a review lesson, and so there's not much new here except a new reading from Caesar's Gallic Wars. If you want to review the material in section 452 or 453, you can do that on your own. You can simply go back to the lessons that cover that material and listen to the lecture again. This is a recorded lecture series, so you can always just go back and listen again and study through a lesson a second time. Same for section 454 at the top of page 172. So in this lesson, we'll focus just on section 455, which is our new section of Caesar's Gallic Wars. And in this particular section, it might be helpful to have a map handy because we're going to be talking about some of the different Gallic tribes. So let's jump in to section 455 and let's start reading. It says, Persuadent Rauracis et Tulingis et Latobrigis finitimis. Let's stop right there. We do not have an explicitly stated subject. What we do have is the verb persuadent. That's the verb persuadeo, which means to persuade. It's third person plural, present tense. And remember that the verb persuadeo takes the dative case. You may remember in the past we've studied how sometimes it actually has a direct object and that you're persuading something to someone. So this verb has sort of an internalized direct object that then is provided to someone in the dative case. You're persuading an idea to someone. Sometimes in grammar, you'll hear that kind of unspoken accusative referred to as an internal accusative. Anyway, the subject is the Helvetii. It's not stated, but we know from the context that that's who persuadent is referring to. So the subject is they and the verb is persuade. And who do they persuade? Well, we have several tribes in the dative plural. They persuade the Rauraci and the Tulingi and the Latobrigi. Those are three tribes, and they're described as finitimis, neighbors, or perhaps neighboring. On the Lenny's Latin class website, there's a page called Study Helps, and there at the top of that page, you have several maps you can study. If you look at the second map, the one that looks black and white, you can click on it and zoom in to the Helvetii. And if you look just to the north of the Helvetii, you'll see the three tribes that they're referring to. The Rauraci, Latobrigi, and Tulingi. They're all three very close to the Helvetii. The Rauraci seem to be positioned between Helvetia and the territory of the Sequani. And then the Latobrigi and the Tulingi seem to be on the other side of the Rhine River. Historically, in general, the Rhine River has been viewed as a long-standing border, sort of a natural border between German territory and French territory. The Germans are on the east, the French are on the west, and that's an important natural border even in ancient times. In a couple of books of Caesar's Gallic Wars, it mentions that he crosses the Rhine, and it's viewed as sort of an unusual thing for him to go across the Rhine. Caesar says that when he does that, when he builds a bridge and goes across the Rhine, the tribes on the other side of the Rhine are very alarmed and surprised by that. The word finitimis here, again, we can translate it as neighboring or as a substantive as neighbors. Doesn't really matter. It's next to the word Latobrigis, but I think we can apply it to all three of these tribes because, as the map tells us, they're all three very close to the Helvetii. So in our translation, let's say this. They persuade the neighboring Rauraci and Tulingi and Latobrigi. Then we have an ut clause, starting with the word uti. Uti is just an alternate spelling for the word ut, so don't let that confuse you. And then we have the subjunctive verb profakiskantur. That's present tense, third person plural, subjunctive. That's the verb profakiskor, which means to set out or depart. So translating uti as that, and then profakiskantur as set out or depart, here's what we have so far. They persuade the neighboring Rauraki and Tulingi and Latobrigi that they set out or that they depart. What kind of ut clause is this? Well, it's very similar to an indirect command. We have not exactly a verb of commanding or asking, but we have a verb of persuading. That's persuadent. So they persuade some people to do some stuff. And we have ut plus a subjunctive verb. So that's very similar to an indirect command. Usually, an indirect command is described as having a verb of commanding, urging, or warning. But I think persuadeo can be thrown in there along with those. In fact, one place I checked listed persuadeo as one of the verbs you can use in an indirect command. So this is basically an indirect command. So they persuade these different tribes that they set forth or set out or depart. That's profakiskantur. We have lots of other words in there to look at too. Una is an adverb that means together. It probably started out as an ablative singular form of the numeral unus, una, unum, and then just through constant use became an adverb. And then cum eis means with them. Cum is a preposition that takes the ablative, and eis is an ablative plural form of is, ea, id. So they persuade them to set out together with them. I was thinking for a moment of why they don't use se cum here instead of cum eis. Then I realized that if it were se cum, it would be referring to the same subject as the subject of profakiskantur. So that would be saying that they persuade those tribes to set out together with themselves, which doesn't make any sense. So with eis can be referring back to the Helvetii, who are not the subject of profakiskantur. The subject of profakiskantur is the Rauraki, the Tulingi, and the Latobrigi. You may think I'm being a little pedantic by mentioning that, but really it's not. That kind of detail really is very important when you're translating Latin. Knowing who the pronouns are referring to is really a big deal, because a lot of times in Latin, they do not explicitly state who the pronouns are referring to and who the subject of the verb is. So you really have to stay mentally alert and keep track of that on your own. So keeping track of who the current subject is within the current clause and how those pronouns and demonstratives apply in that situation, that's actually kind of a big deal when you're translating Latin. Because if you make a mistake in figuring out who a certain word is referring to, you can really get the whole thing wrong. So you have to be kind of detail-oriented and fastidious about those small details. Okay, so the Helvetii are planning to burn all their stuff and set out on a big exodus. But they say to their neighboring tribes, they say, hey, our plan is great. Why don't you come along with us? So they persuade them to set out together with them. I guess their attitude is the more the merrier. Why would they want to invite 3 additional tribes to come with them? I have no idea. Again, we're just taking Julius Caesar's word for it. That's what the text says, and so that's what we're trying to analyze. Let's take a look at the word usi. The word usi is a form of the verb utor, which is a deponent verb that means to use. Keep in mind that utor is one of those puff-v or puffy verbs. We have the acronym PUFFV, or if you put a little line at the bottom of the V and make it look like a Y, you can say puffy. And so that acronym helps you keep track of the 5 common deponent verbs that take the ablative case. So we have potior, utor, fruor, fungor, and wescor. And so the U in the acronym PUFV or Puffy, that's for utor. Okay, so utor is a deponent verb that takes the ablative case. It means to use. And so we have utor, uti, and then usus sum would be the perfect tense form. Usus sum, at first glance, appears to be a perfect passive form, but it's really active because utor is a deponent verb. So what does that imply about usi? Well, usi is the perfect participle form of utor. So usus, usa, usum would be the perfect tense participle of utor. It's not the perfect passive participle because utor is deponent. Instead, it's a perfect active participle. And so here we see that as an adjective modifying the Rauraki, Tulingi, and Latobrigi. We can translate usi as having used or having made use of. And then, again, keep in mind, utor takes the ablative. So notice that eodem and concilio both are ablative. Concilio, that's the second declension noun concilium, which means plan. And then eodem means the same. That's a form of edem, right? So eodem concilio says the same plan, and it's in the ablative because it's being used along with usi. So eodem, usi, and concilio, together those 3 words will say, having used the same plan. Taking it from the top, they persuade the neighboring Rauraki and Tulingi and Latobrigi that they set out together with them, having used the same plan. So when they say, having used the same plan, what exactly does that mean? It means that they're trying to get their neighbors to burn all their stuff too, to burn their towns and villages and burn their crops. And in doing so, it creates sort of a point of no return. Because once you've burned all your stuff, you can't really go back to it. There's nothing to go back to. Why would this seem like a good plan to anyone? I don't know. Again, it's just here in the text, and so we're just working with what we have. Next, we have a big ablative absolute. That's opedis suis, vicisque exustis. All those words are ablative plural because they are an ablative absolute. Exustis is the 4th principal part of exuro. So exustus, exusta, exustum would mean burned up. That's not a deponent verb, so that 4th principal part is a perfect passive participle. Again, that's exustus, exusta, exustum, and it means burned up. So opedis and exustis together would say, with their towns having been burned up. And then suis means their, so it's with their towns having been burned up. Again, vicus means village, so vicisque says, and their villages. So the whole ablative absolute reads, with their towns and their villages having been burned up. Okay, so that's an ablative absolute, otherwise known as an ablative of attendant circumstances. Why? Because it tells us the circumstances that surround some kind of action or activity. So this whole first part, let's take it from the top. It says, they persuade the neighboring Rauraki and Tulingi and Latobrigi that they set out together with them, having used the same plan, with their towns and villages having been burned up. And if you would like to arrange those words in a different order in your English translation, that's fine. Go right ahead. I just translated it into English in a manner that seemed smooth to me in English. Starting with the word boiosque, we are no longer within the ut clause. We're starting a new sentence and we're back to just regular speech with an indicative verb. The que suffix here at the end of the word boiosque, that is joining a whole new clause. Again, we saw recently that que is not just for joining two adjacent nouns. It can really do much more than that. It can join an entire clause to another clause. So we throw in the word and here to get us into the new clause. And boios is a tribe, and that's in the accusative plural. They are the direct object here of the verb adskiskunt, which is the last word in this reading. And we have a really long extended relative clause, starting with qui, that goes for almost 2 full lines. We do not have an explicitly stated subject. We have the verb adskiskunt, and that's all we have. The verb is adskisko, which means, well, it's related to the verb scio. Okay, in Latin, scio means to know, like K-N-O-W. We also have the noun scientia, which means knowledge. That's where we get our English word science. So in the word adskiskunt, the S, C, and I, that's the same S, C, and I found in our English word science. So it's related to the Latin verb scio, which means to know. And there's an inceptive form, which is skisko. And skisko can mean things like approve. Because if you get to know someone and you approve of them, that's related to knowing something. If you know someone or get to know them, you have to get to know someone if you want to approve them, right? So this is the verb skisko with the preposition ad. So adskisko has to do with accepting someone, approving them into something. You know, if you have a club and you accept someone new into the club, that could be adskisko. So the idea here with adskiskunt is they accept, they receive, they adopt, they admit. We could even say they recruit or win over. So the subject is the helvetii, the verb is adskiskunt, they accept, receive, recruit, admit. I like the word admit. Let's try that. It's working with sibi. Sibi is referring back to the helvetii. So sibi and adskiskunt, along with the word boiosque from line 3, those 3 words together will say the helvetii admit to themselves the boios, that is the Boii tribe, the tribe known as the Boii. We have the word and at the end of the word boiosque. Que ending there gives us and. So it says, and they admit to themselves the Boii. A couple of other words here that describe the Boii. Rekeptos, that's a perfect passive participle of the verb recipio. We can translate that as having been received or just simply received. And then ad se, again, se is reflexive, so that's to themselves, referring to the helvetii. And socios means allies, and that's what we call an appositive. It's standing in apposition with boios. So really we have 2 reflexives here. We have se and sibi. So let's put it together with adskiskunt. They admit to themselves the Boii, having been received to them, or to themselves really, as allies. So we have a total of 4 tribes here that the helvetii are trying to persuade to join them. First, they persuade the Rauraki, and they persuade the Tulingi, they persuade the Latobrigi, and then they get the Boii in on the act. So they're really getting 4 different tribes to join in with them. We've identified 3 of these tribes, the Rauraki, Tulingi, and Latobrigi. We saw them on the map. They're all located just to the north of the Helvetian territory The Boii are a little harder to find. They are more to the east. One map which might prove helpful is the map that's actually in the first year of Latin on page 78. If you look at that map, in the extreme east area, you'll see a little town called Noreia. So take a look at that. I'll be referring back to that in a moment. If you have the printed copy of this book that is published by Armfield Academic Press, in that particular book, that map has been moved to the back of the book, and it's on page 321. So let's keep reading, and in a moment, we're going to refer back to that map where it shows Noreia. So what we have so far is the Helvetii accept or admit the tribe known as the Boii. They admit them to themselves. They bring them into their own scheme. Receptos, having been received, ad se, to themselves, socios, as allies. And then we have a relative clause that tells us more information about the Boii. Qui is a relative pronoun starting a relative clause. It's masculine and plural because its antecedent, boiosque, is masculine and plural, but it's nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. In the relative clause, qui is the subject. And we have a couple of pluperfect verbs in the relative clause, incoluerant and transierant. So we're going to learn what the Boii had done. Remember that the pluperfect tense gets translated into English with the word had. So incoluerant, that's the verb incolo, which means to dwell, to inhabit, or to live someplace. So qui plus incoluerant will say who had lived or who had dwelt. Transrhenum means across the Rhine. What does it mean that they were across the Rhine? It means that they were in German territory, really. Then we have the word et. Then we have transierant. They had crossed, or they had gone across. Transierant is the verb transeo. That's just trans plus eo, literally to go across. And then in agrum noricum says into Norican territory. Oftentimes, the word ager from the second declension means field, but it can also mean land, territory, stuff like that. Noricum is an adjective meaning Norican, describing some place or perhaps some people group. So in agrum noricum, we'll say into Norican territory. So if you go back to that map that I mentioned earlier, in the printed version of the book, it's in the back. If you're using a PDF that you got from Google Books or from some other place, it's on page 78. So if you look very far to the east, almost to the edge of the page, you'll see Noreia. So as far as I can tell from studying maps and from reading about it online, it seems that the Boii started out in Germany, and that's why Caesar refers to them as being across the Rhine. Apparently they move to the south and end up attacking the area known as Noreia in the very eastern part of the map I mentioned. So it looks like there may be more than one group of Boii. They may be doing different things at different times, so it's not fully clear. But apparently, from what this text is saying, the Boii lived further north, but then came south and attacked that area. Okay, so the relative clause so far says, the Boii who had dwelt across the Rhine and had crossed into Norican territory. And then we have yet another conjunction, the que ending on the end of the word Norieiamque. Norieiamque opugnarant. Opugnarant is yet another pluperfect verb. It's the verb opugno, which means to attack. This is a syncopated form of the verb. You could have this with a V and an E before the letter R. It could be opugnawerant, but here the V and the E have been chopped out, so we could refer to this as a syncopated form. Anyway, it's pluperfect third-person plural, so it says they had attacked, and then Noriaeam is the direct object. Note that the pluperfect tense is helping Julius Caesar to tell us the backstory of the boii. He's telling us things that happened even before the time frame of his main narrative. The main narrative that he's telling us about is the plan of the Helvetii to burn all their stuff and do a mass exodus. But with the pluperfect tense, he's telling us that even before that, they had, the boii had dwelt across the Rhine, they had crossed over the Rhine, they had attacked Noreia. So he's moving one notch back in time, even further into the past, to tell us some things about the boii. So let's take this last part of the reading, starting with boiosque, and let's try to put it all together into one smooth English translation. And the English word order will not match the Latin word order. We're going to have to rearrange it a bit. In English word order, if you take a direct object and put it first, it can really make it sound strange. It can make it sound for a minute like it's the subject, and it can really be confusing. Some Latin teachers, not all of them, but a few of them really insist that their students keep the same word order in their English translation as the word order that's in the Latin. And I'm really not a fan of that. I think it's good to do for practice, but English depends on word order much more than Latin does to express meaning. In Latin, word order can express emphasis or something that you're trying to bring to the forefront. In English, we depend on it really more just for basic meaning, just to say what is happening. So the role of word order in Latin and the role of word order in English are not the same. So keeping the same word order can be awkward. So let's not keep the same word order. Let's rearrange it a bit and try to bring it smoothly into English, just so we can understand what's going on. Starting with the word boiosque, we have, and they admit to themselves the boii, having been received to themselves as allies, who had dwelt across the Rhine and who had crossed into Norican territory and had attacked Noreia. Okay, that brings us to the end of yet another installment of Lenny's Latin class. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you again next time in Lesson 58.